Welcome to Lakewood Cemetery. For more than 130 years, Lakewood Cemetery has been a haven in the heart of Minneapolis. At Lakewood, visitors enjoy the beauty and serenity of nature, museum-quality art, and architectural artistry. Lakewood also gives visitors a glimpse of history, represented through the lives of those who made Minneapolis what it is today. Lakewood's story begins in the early days of Minneapolis. In the late 1840s, Minneapolis was only a rough riverfront outpost when Colonel John Stevens settled here. He built his house, which you can see on the right behind these teepees in this Dakota village. It was the first permanent dwelling in Minneapolis. Another Dakota village occupied the eastern shore of Lake Calhoun, near what would become the Lakewood site. Today, the remnants of an ancient Dakota trail, linking the lakes with the Mississippi River, leads to the gates of Lakewood Cemetery. That trail is now called Hennepin Avenue. By 1857, Minneapolis was a sparsely settled town of rough wooden buildings and rutted dirt roads. This is Washington Avenue, the main business district at the time. The city grew fast, thanks to the booming railroad and to flour and lumber milling along the Mississippi River. In 1871, 4 years after Minneapolis was incorporated and 13 years after Minnesota achieved statehood, Lakewood Cemetery was founded. That year, the city boasted more than 13,000 residents. By the early 1870s, opportunity in the Great Northwest had drawn ambitious New Englanders to Minnesota. They brought arts, entertainment, and events to the city. The Pence Opera House, shown here, was the cultural center of Minneapolis. It was built in 1867 on Hennepin and 2nd Street. These early civic leaders established businesses that are still known today. Here, for example, is the forerunner of Norwest Bank, now Wells Fargo, in 1875. These leaders also founded Lakewood Cemetery. Many of their names are still familiar to Minneapolis today. Colonel William King, for example, a businessman and newspaper publisher, developed the idea for Lakewood Cemetery in July 1871. He and 14 other people formed the Lyndale Cemetery Association, named for King's father, Lyndon King. They changed the name to Lakewood the following year. Charles Loring, who came to Minneapolis from Maine in 1860, was one member of the association. Loring turned a 3-acre cow pasture at 7th Street and 22nd Avenue South into the city's first park. Today, it's called Murphy Square. Loring spent 35 years developing the Minneapolis park system. In 1890, the city's Central Park was renamed Loring Park in his honor. This is what it looked like that year. Another Lakewood founder was William Washburn. Washburn was appointed Surveyor General of Minnesota by President Abraham Lincoln in 1861. He built a fortune in lumber, flour milling, and railroads before turning to politics and going on to the U.S. Senate. His brother, C.C. Washburn, joined him in Minnesota and founded the Washburn-Crosby Mill, which is now General Mills. Attorney and land developer Thomas Lowry created Lake Street in the 1870s. And later, in 1886, he consolidated the transit systems of Minneapolis and St. Paul into the Twin City Rapid Transit Company. This company began with a few horse-drawn carts and eventually became Metro Transit. The Lowrys lived on a 7-acre estate on top of Hennepin Hill, which is now called Lowry Hill. The estate was later purchased by T.B. Walker, who built the Walker Art Center nearby. There was also Richard Mendenhall, a businessman with a passion for horticulture. Mendenhall was the city's first florist. He is shown here in 1890 in the middle of the back row in his top hat. The land the founders chose for Lakewood Cemetery was owned by William King, 130 acres between Lake Calhoun and Lake Harriet. King sold the land for $21,000, payable over 1 year at 7% interest. The founders financed the purchase themselves. They created 250 shares of stock at $100 per share. $21,000 was used to purchase the land, and the remaining $4,000 financed improvements. When Lakewood was founded, Minneapolis's southern edge was where Franklin Avenue is today. The founders chose a site out in the country between Lakes Harriet and Calhoun. Visitors had to travel to Lakewood by horse and buggy on an unpaved road. Lake Calhoun was establishing a reputation as a popular summer resort. It drew tourists from around the United States. William King built this hotel on the lake's north shore in 1880. In 1874, the Lakewood Association bought another 25 acres from Colonel King to expand Lakewood's east side. 10 years later, they began to purchase the adjoining Saunders Park neighborhood. The houses there were moved or demolished, and Lakewood's boundary crept east toward Kings Highway. Lakewood acquired the rest of Saunders Park over the next 2 decades. By the turn of the century, Lakewood had grown from its original 130 acres to its present 250 acres. In its early years, Lakewood Cemetery functioned much like our city parks do today, as a focus of community life. This was true of garden cemeteries in other cities. A streetcar running along the west side of the cemetery made visiting easy. In 1895, the popular Lake Harriet streetcar brought people to Lakewood from downtown Minneapolis for a nickel. In 1906, Lakewood constructed a public comfort building at the Lake Calhoun streetcar entrance to the cemetery. A female attendant was hired to greet visitors and help ladies freshen up after the dusty trip. Until 1916, families came not only to visit, but also to tend graves. They planted trees, shrubs, and flowers around the monuments of their loved ones. The monument near the center of this photo was cared for this way. Many years later, the shrubs the family put here are still in place. Close ties to a cemetery seem strange to some of us today, but they were common a century ago. Even in 1908, more than half of all the deaths occurred in people under 40. 16% of Minneapolis children died before their first birthday. 32% of the population died by age 20, and 20% more died before age 40. Only 1 person in 4 lived to be 60 years old. As a result, large-scale commemoration was central to community life. Decoration Day in 1924, as you see in this photo, was a day of pageantry, complete with military parades and tributes to the dead. Lakewood holds an annual Memorial Day ceremony at the Soldiers' Memorial. This picture is of a ceremony in the 1920s. Lakewood has made many changes to the landscape over the years. In 1890, Lakewood completed its first stone chapel, as you can see in the center of this photo. The picture was taken from the top of a hill in Lakewood that was once the highest point in Hennepin County. It was later leveled out to develop another section of the cemetery. In 1913, Lakewood started converting a 15-acre swamp into the beautiful 8-acre lake it features today. This photo shows the type of equipment that was used. After draining the water from the swamp into Lake Harriet, laborers used picks and shovels and horse-drawn dredging equipment to dig a new lake basin 80 feet deep. Lakewood also helped beautify the surrounding lakes area. In 1890, the cemetery donated 35 acres along its south side to help create Lindale Park, shown here in 1925. The park's rose garden, created in 1907, is the second oldest in the United States. In 1915, Lakewood donated land between 36th and 38th Street to extend Kings Highway, also known as DuPont Avenue. This photo of DuPont Avenue was taken in the 1920s. Lakewood once maintained 6 enormous greenhouses like the one shown here, each larger than a football field. Over the years, Lakewood Cemetery has contributed to the development of landscape horticulture in Minnesota. At one time, nursery managers in the region came to Lakewood to study the adaptability of plants to climate and disease. And students at the University of Minnesota made field trips to Lakewood every fall to study and identify unusual plant species. The cemetery now contains a number of plant species found nowhere else in the state. Here is the greenhouse showroom in 1923. Today, Lakewood has one of the largest cemetery greenhouse operations in the United States. Groundskeepers plant more than 95,000 flowers each season, and the greenhouse still has a tradition of selling fresh flowers, potted plants, and seasonal arrangements. Lakewood is the leading buyer of bulbs in Minnesota, purchasing 30,000 every year. The bulbs are replaced annually to guarantee uniformity in size and bloom. Lakewood features the same flowers year after year. Red tulips greet visitors at the front entrance each spring. And the cemetery's flower beds are always planted with meticulous precision. Lakewood's greenhouse staff plants 1,500 urns each year. And the grounds crew maintains more than 100,000 monuments and markers. As a result of their labor, Lakewood is beautiful in every season. American cemetery art flourished between 1850 and 1930. During those years, the country's most prominent architects and sculptors designed funeral monuments. Their works were listed in tour guides of the nation's major cities, and they attracted visitors much as the sculpture garden near the Walker Art Center does today. The visitors came to admire the architectural detail in the beautifully carved stone. Monuments were usually centered on large lots, and they might incorporate a private mausoleum, sarcophagus, or sculpture. Many monuments featured poems or epitaphs or tributes to family members. 3 styles were popular during the heyday of cemetery art: Classical Revival, Egyptian Revival, and Medieval Revival. Lakewood has examples of all 3 types, but most of Lakewood's monuments fall into the first 2 categories. Classical Revival monuments include the Lowry Goodrich Mausoleum, a replica of the Parthenon found in Athens. It is one of the most outstanding cemetery monuments in the United States. It is also the largest monument in Lakewood Cemetery. Another Classical Revival style is shown here. A woman draped in flowing Grecian robes typifies this style. This monument, the tallest at Lakewood at 45 feet, was commissioned in 1907 by Louis Rochelot and depicts his wife Charlotte, who died at the age of 37. There are also 2 typical Egyptian Revival styles. The first is the pyramid, which became popular following the archaeological discoveries in the late 1800s. The Wood family mausoleum shown here was constructed in 1905. The second Egyptian style is the obelisk. Many fine examples can be found at Lakewood. This is the monument to Johann Emil Oberhofer, who founded the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra in 1903. Musical notes are carved into the base of the obelisk. Here's an example of a medieval revival style mausoleum for the Mars family. This style is characterized by its pointed arches and steeply pitched roof lines. Not everyone was enamored with the Egyptian classical or medieval monument styles. Many of those buried at Lakewood preferred natural simple markers such as large glacial boulders, which symbolize America's vast wilderness. Lakewood also has countless one-of-a-kind monuments. This one representing 5-year-old Ella Louise Hankinson was erected in 1888. This touching monument to a young child was one of the first monuments at Lakewood. The city's ethnic diversity is reflected throughout Lakewood. Monuments to Swedish, Russian, and Greek families are interspersed with those to Irish, German, and Hmong families. This pagoda adorns a section reserved for members of the city's Chinese community. Fraternal organizations are also represented at Lakewood. This life-sized bronze elk was commissioned in 1900 to honor the members of the Brotherhood of Fraternal Order of Elks. A fireman in the square-billed cap and dress uniform of 1892 stands atop the monument commissioned by the Minneapolis Fire Department Relief Association. Lakewood also has several war memorials. The Grand Army of the Republic Memorial was donated by Lakewood in 1889 to honor the Civil War dead. The Soldiers Memorial is dedicated to soldiers of the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and World War I. There are also memorials erected in remembrance of the city's tragic events. This memorial obelisk lists the names of the 18 men killed in the Washburn A Mill explosion in 1878. It was the worst milling disaster in the city's history. Memorials not only function as a place to list names and dates. Many memorials are etched with various symbols of remembrance. Lakewood is rich with symbols that aid remembrance of the individuals and families who are buried there. This symbol, a sheaf of wheat, is a sign of a long and fruitful life of more than 70 years. A draped urn symbolizes a dwelling or house and is often used as a sign of deep sorrow and grief. The urn was a popular memorial style. You'll find many examples at Lakewood. These wonderfully detailed tree stones are a product of the Victorian rusticity movement popular from the 1880s until about 1905. The tree is a universal symbol of life. The surrounding gravestones are parts of the tree, or descendants of the family. In Buddhist tradition, these dog-like creatures serve as guardians of the deceased. They are called fu dogs, or Shi Tzu of Fo. In 1951, Lakewood developed its first memorial park section. Instead of traditional upright monuments, Memorial Park grave markers are flush with the ground. Because each section features only one monument, memorial parks preserve the natural landscape. Today, Lakewood has 9 memorial park gardens. Their monuments cover a range of religious and secular themes. The Lakewood Memorial Chapel was built in 1910 and is the architectural centerpiece of Lakewood Cemetery. It was designed by Minneapolis architect Harry Weil Jones, who designed the first Lake Harriet Pavilion, Butler Square, and other landmark buildings. The dome chapel was modeled after the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. The chapel's double-door entrance is built of solid bronze and embellished with ancient religious symbols. When it was completed in 1910, the Lakewood Memorial Chapel was the only building in the United States with an authentic mosaic interior. And as you can see, it's a stunning work of art. New York designer Charles Lamb modeled it on the mosaic design in the San Marco Cathedral in Venice. In 1983, the Lakewood Chapel was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The chapel is still the most perfect example of Byzantine mosaic art in the United States today. To complete the work, Charles Lamb enlisted the services of 6 of Italy's most skilled mosaic artists who had just finished work on the Vatican. They are shown here in a drawing from Lamb Studios. They created more than 10 million tiles, each no larger than a fingernail, from marble, colored stone, and glass fused with gold and silver. Inside, the 40-foot-high dome is ringed with 24 stained glass windows, which serve as a sundial, telling the time of day and the season. The 12 angels in the dome relate to the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 gates to the holy city, and the 12 disciples of Christ. At the 4 points of the compass, angels holding red roses represent the 4 corners of the earth. The angels' gowns also have symbolic meaning. The red gown represents life. Yellow means death. And the blue represents resurrection. The angels have no feet, to show that they're always in flight and never touch the earth. Their fully extended wings symbolize their protective spirit. The alcove behind the chapel rostrum is lined with entwined olive trees whose fruit is known for its healing properties. 4 other mosaic figures adorn the side walls beneath the chapel dome. They represent love, faith, memory, and hope. This figure depicts love, and this figure is memory. The figures are based on paintings by portrait artist Ella Condy Lamb, wife of the chapel's interior designer. In 1996, Lakewood embarked on a year-long project of renovating the chapel. With architect Jim W. Miller, new lighting and heating systems were installed. A new crematory was built in the lower level, and the front entrance was landscaped. Part of the task was to undo alterations made to the chapel over the past decades. As you can see in this photo, yellow paper had been added behind the stained glass windows to darken the chapel. The copper doors and window casings had tarnished to black. A reddish-brown carpet covered the floor, and curtains hung in the entryway doors. Now the yellow paper has been removed, and as you can see here, the copper has been cleaned to its original state, and the carpet has been removed to reveal the Italian marble floor. The curtains on the entryway doors were removed, and new glass panes were installed. These panes were decorated by Minneapolis glass workers with etched symbols echoing those on the bronze doors and the mosaic olive trees in the alcove. 4 new floor lamps were created to go with the chapel's original light fixtures, and a large stained glass chandelier globe designed by Lamb was restored to its place above the pulpit. The directors who oversaw the construction of the chapel chose to include a crematory in its design, one of the first crematories ever placed in a cemetery chapel. This is the original crematory after the 1996 renovation. These crematories still function today. However, as part of the renovation, 2 new crematories were added, as well as a viewing room constructed especially for cultures and religions that require active participation in the cremation process. In 1967, Lakewood completed its Memorial Community Mausoleum. The mausoleum was constructed to provide above-ground entombment as well as traditional burial. The mausoleum houses 7 columbarium rooms with 2,000 individual and family niches for cremated remains. It also accommodates 3,000 crypts within the corridors of the building or in semi-private alcoves. The building's most striking features are its 24 large stained glass windows. The windows express both spiritual and secular themes. When Lakewood began, traditional lot burial was the norm. Today, Lakewood provides a wide choice of burial options. There is traditional lot interment, or more contemporary memorial park burial. Lakewood's Pool of Reflections, which links the mausoleum with a chapel, contains 1,100 outdoor garden crypts. Lakewood also provides entombment in its mausoleum niches or crypts. For visitors willing to do a little walking, Lakewood Cemetery shares the stories of people from all parts of life and all points in American history. 19-year-old Maggie Menzel, for example, who died in January 1872, was the first person buried at Lakewood. Edwin Stone was killed in the Sioux Uprising in 1862. He was buried in another cemetery and later moved to Lakewood. Callum de Villiers, who died in 1973, designed his own monument to feature his 1933 marathon dancing record. Governor Floyd B. Olson was the state's first farmer labor governor. His death in 1936 drew 30,000 people to Lakewood. To date, it is the largest funeral ever held here. 2 railroad cars full of flowers were placed on his grave. Hubert H. Humphrey, Minneapolis mayor, U.S. Senator, and Vice President of the United States, is also buried at Lakewood. Humphrey's funeral in 1978 was a national event. People still come from all over the country to visit his grave. And in September 1995, Minnesota Governor Rudy Perpich was buried here. Finally, there are the lives revealed through epitaphs. Each one tells a story. Eva McKinsey's epitaph reads, "She gave her life trying to rescue her 2 only children. Eva and her children were killed in a train derailment in 1891. Mary Stevens was the daughter of pioneer settler Colonel John Stevens. Some epitaphs describe a life of achievement. This one was erected by Sir Joseph Francis, who bought Lakewood's very first lot. His epitaph reads, "The father and founder of the U.S. Life-Saving Service, 1872. Founder of the American Shipwreck Society. Inventor of the corrugated metallic in-floor life preserver. Received the thanks of the U.S. Congress. Honored by the U.S. Congress for his service to humanity. Honored, decorated, rewarded, and knighted by the crowned heads of Europe. Born March 12, 1801, died May 10, 1893. And Clyde Earl Hagen gives us something to think about. His epitaph reads, "My only regrets are the temptations I have successfully resisted." So in the freshness of spring, through the summer, to the bold color of autumn, to the serene beauty of winter, when it is most evident that Lakewood is a sanctuary for wildlife, Lakewood Cemetery is a great place to see beautiful monuments and sculpture. To live in the hearts of those we leave is not to die. Lakewood Cemetery, celebrating life for over 130 years.